The sound that stopped me cold wasn't dramatic. It wasn't an explosion or a crash or even a raised voice. It was the sharp scrape of a heavy chair being shoved backward across a marble ballroom floor, and then absolute silence. Every conversation in that glittering room died at once, as if someone had pressed a button and unplugged the world. I turned toward the sound. An elderly man in a dark suit was on his feet, his eyes fixed not on my face, but on my wrist, on the worn, scratched, utterly ordinary navy watch peeking out from beneath the cuff of my evening dress. His expression was unlike anything I had ever seen at a social event like this one. No practiced smile, no polished gaze. His face had folded into something raw and stunned, the face of a man who had just seen a ghost. He crossed the distance between us slowly, deliberately, like a man moving through water. "Ma'am," his voice carried the deep, unhurried authority of someone who had spent decades commanding rooms far larger and far more dangerous than this one. "That watch." He stopped just short of our table. His eyes hadn't moved. "Where did you get it?" Nearly 200 of Charleston's most powerful people, bank presidents, federal judges, real estate developers, politicians, physicians, philanthropists, had gone completely, utterly, breathlessly still. My husband, Richard, sat beside me with his jaw tight, wearing the expression of a man who cannot decide whether he is annoyed or alarmed. I swallowed once, then I answered, "It belonged to my father." The man's face changed again. Something behind his eyes shifted, something deep and private. "What was his name?" I hesitated for only a moment. "Captain Michael Hargrove." The color left his face so completely and so quickly that I actually reached out instinctively, afraid he might fall. He didn't fall, he straightened. He pulled himself to his full height with the kind of posture that doesn't come from youth, it comes from a lifetime of discipline. And then he said it, quietly, almost to himself, looking first at me, then at Richard, then back at me again, as if confirming something he couldn't quite believe was real. "Good God," a slow shake of his head, "he has absolutely no idea who you are." That sentence became the most repeated line in Charleston's social circles for the next 12 months. It traveled from the ballroom to the country clubs, from the dinner tables to the veterans' halls, from one hushed conversation to another. But to understand why those words landed the way they did, why they stunned every person in that room into silence, you have to understand the night that led to them. And to understand that night, you have to understand the life I'd spent 60 years living. My name is Eleanor Hargrove. I am 61 years old. I spent 27 years serving in the United States Navy, and I retired as a commander. I am not famous. I have never sought attention. I have never been particularly comfortable in rooms full of glittering people performing their wealth at one another. I grew up in military housing, the kind with thin walls and shared fences, where every family on the block understood what a deployment felt like from the inside, where every mother had learned how to explain absence to young children, where service wasn't a career choice but a way of being. My father served for nearly 30 years. His father served before him. My great-uncle served in a war whose name the younger generation now reads only in textbooks. We were not wealthy. We were never wealthy. My mother used coupons and bought clothes at end-of-season sales. Vacations meant piling into the car to visit relatives 2 states over. The car was always used. The furniture was always functional. Nothing in our home was chosen for appearances. But I never once felt poor in any way that mattered. Because in our house, the currency was different. Respect, duty, integrity, accountability. The belief lived out daily, not just spoken, that the measure of a person was found not in their bank account, but in what they did when it cost them something. My father had a saying he returned to often, in moments both large and small. Character is what remains when nobody is watching. He wasn't a philosopher. He wasn't a man who gave speeches. He simply lived that sentence every single day and expected the rest of us to do the same. That inheritance eventually carried me into the Navy myself. I served 2.5 decades. I did my job. I came home. I was proud of the work and grateful for the people alongside me, but I was never someone who talked about it much, even in retirement. That wasn't how I was raised. Several years after I retired, I met Richard Collins. He was charming, sharp, relentlessly confident. He had built a thriving commercial real estate company in Charleston from almost nothing, and there was something genuinely impressive about the energy he carried, the way he could walk into any room and immediately reorganize it around himself without appearing to try. After years of structured military life, I found his particular kind of ambition interesting. Different from anything I'd grown up around, but interesting. We married when I was 47. For a while, things were good, or at least I believed they were. Hindsight is a precise and unforgiving instrument. Looking back now, I can identify the pattern clearly: the small comments that seemed harmless in isolation, the subtle redirections, the particular kind of silence Richard employed when my family came up in conversation. The way his attention sharpened around wealthy entrepreneurs and Charleston old money, and softened, like a phone screen timing out, whenever the subject shifted to service, sacrifice, or anyone who hadn't translated their life into a net worth statement. He never openly insulted my family, not at first. He simply found them uninteresting. I remember one evening, 3 or 4 years into our marriage, when Richard was leafing through an old photo album I'd left out on the coffee table. Pictures of my father in uniform, my grandfather aboard a ship, military ceremonies, deployments, the folded, ordinary moments of a life spent in service. He closed the album after just a few minutes and set it aside. "Interesting," he said. That was it, one word. A polite, blank word that meant nothing and closed the conversation as efficiently as a door being shut. I felt a quiet sting of disappointment, not anger, just the particular sadness of realizing someone you love has just shown you something true about themselves, something small but accurate. I let it go. I always let things go. My father believed that genuine dignity was often expressed through silence, through choosing not to demand credit, not to argue for recognition, not to convert your worth into a verbal invoice. There is wisdom in that. But sometimes, silence has a cost that compounds over years. The charity gala took place in early April. It was one of Charleston's signature annual events. Black tie, crystal chandeliers, a string quartet, the harbor glittering beyond floor-to-ceiling windows, expensive wine in crystal glasses, the entire machinery of a certain kind of social world operating at full, practiced capacity. Richard had spent weeks preparing for it. Not weeks of charity preparation, weeks of social preparation. Which donors to approach, which businessmen to have photographed with, which conversations to engineer and which to avoid. Events like this were his environment, and he moved through them with the fluency of someone who had trained for exactly this terrain. I attended because I was his wife. At one point in the evening, we settled at a round table with a group of local power brokers, a banker, a state circuit judge, 2 prominent real estate developers, a woman who chaired several charitable foundations. Polished, pleasant, entirely unremarkable conversation flowed around the table. At some point, one of the women smiled at me with the genuine warmth people produce when they're actually curious. "Eleanor, tell us about your family. Where are you from?" It was the simplest question in the world, the kind people ask 100 times at 100 events. Before I could draw a full breath to answer, Richard laughed. It wasn't a cruel laugh. It was the laugh of a man who considers himself gracious, who believes he is simply filling the silence with good humor. "Her family," he lifted his wine glass with an easy shrug. "Military people, career military, the whole lot of them." The table nodded politely. A conversational footnote acknowledged. He took a sip, set the glass down, and then, with absolutely no evident awareness of what he was doing, he said it. "A family of nobodies, really." The words weren't shouted, they weren't intended to wound. That somehow made them worse. A few people offered those small, uncertain social chuckles, the kind that mean I don't know how to respond to that, so I'll pretend it was light. One man looked briefly uncomfortable. Nobody challenged it. The conversation moved on. But I had stopped moving. A family of nobodies. I sat very still and let those words settle through me, the way cold water settles through you when you wade in slowly, fully, until it reaches everything. I thought about my grandfather, about the Pacific Theater, about the years of his life he spent doing things he never once described to his grandchildren, not because he'd forgotten them, but because he'd chosen to carry them quietly. I thought about my father, about the months at sea, the missed birthdays, the holidays spent on a ship somewhere, writing letters home in careful, steady handwriting, the years he gave to something larger than himself without ever once asking to be applauded for it. I thought about my mother, about what it takes to raise children alone for long stretches, to explain absence and uncertainty to small people who just want their father home, to hold a family together with both hands for decades. A family of nobodies. Something tightened in my chest. Not anger, not exactly. Something older and quieter than anger. The particular grief of watching someone you love reveal a gap in themselves you'd been carefully not looking at for years. I looked down at my wrist. My father's Navy watch. He'd worn it every day of his working life. The case was scratched from decades of use. The original band had been replaced twice. There was nothing luxurious about it, nothing that would draw a second glance from someone scanning a room for status signals. I wore it on significant occasions, not to make a statement, simply to stay connected to something real. I could have responded to Richard's comment. I could have corrected him, itemized my family's record, translated their lives into the language that room might have recognized. But my father's voice was in my head, as it so often is, and what he said was, "Never perform your worth for an audience that hasn't earned the right to evaluate it." So I stayed quiet, I looked down at the watch, I breathed slowly. And from somewhere, across that glittering ballroom, an elderly man stopped walking and stared. I didn't notice General Warren Alcott immediately. He was simply another silver-haired man in a dark suit at a charity event full of silver-haired men in dark suits. But he had noticed me, or rather he had noticed my wrist. I became aware of him when the conversation at our table began to feel strange, when I realized that several people were no longer looking at each other, but at something approaching from across the room. I turned. The man walking toward our table moved with the particular unhurried certainty of someone who has never in his adult life needed to rush toward anything. Every step was deliberate. His eyes were fixed on me with an intensity that had nothing aggressive in it, only something that looked, improbably, like recognition. When he reached the table, he didn't address the group. He addressed me. "Ma'am, forgive the interruption." The voice was exactly what you'd expect from a man of his bearing, low, measured, with the permanent calm of someone who has delivered difficult news and decisive orders, and found that the same composure serves for both. "May I ask you something?" I rose, of course. He gestured toward my wrist. "That watch, where did you get it?" I glanced down, momentarily thrown. The watch looked ordinary, it always had, scratched steel, worn leather. "It belonged to my father," I said. Something shifted behind his eyes. "Your father." His voice had changed slightly. "Careful now, what was his name?" I told him. For a moment, General Warren Alcott simply looked at me. Then the color left his face, not gradually, but all at once like a light going off. His expression moved through something I couldn't quite name. Recognition. Emotion. Something that looked, in a decorated military man of his age and rank, startlingly like grief. He whispered something I couldn't hear. Then he straightened, squared his shoulders, and said clearly to the entire table, to the neighboring tables that had quietly tuned in, to the growing perimeter of curious guests who had drifted closer without quite knowing why. "Captain Hargrove's daughter." "Yes, sir," I said. His hands trembled slightly, not from age, not from frailty, from something else entirely. Nearby conversations had stopped. People were watching. The string quartet continued softly in the distance, but the social noise of the room had drained away from our corner of it, leaving something cleaner and quieter in its place. General Alcott extended his hand to me with a formality that felt almost ceremonial. I took it. He held it for a moment longer than a handshake required. "I haven't heard that name spoken aloud in nearly 20 years, he said. "I wasn't certain I ever would again." Richard cleared his throat and offered the polite interjection of a man who is confused but determined to remain in control of his surroundings. "I'm sorry, did you know Aliner's father?" The general turned to look at my husband. The expression on his face in that moment was one I will carry with me for the rest of my life. It wasn't contempt. It wasn't anger. It was the expression of a man confronting something he genuinely cannot process, a kind of stunned, sorrowful disbelief. He looked at Richard for a long moment, then he answered. "Know him?" He said it quietly, as if tasting the inadequacy of the word. "Your wife's father was one of the finest officers I encountered in 40 years of active service." A pause. Knowing him was a privilege I did not take lightly. The table had gone completely silent. Several people who had been standing within earshot had stopped pretending not to listen. Richard smiled with the practiced ease of a man buying time. I'm sure he was an exceptional officer. He was considerably more than that. General Alcott's voice remained even, but something behind it had hardened slightly. He looked back at me. "Did he ever speak to you about the North Atlantic?" I frowned. "No, sir, he didn't." The general smiled, a small, sad, entirely unsurprised smile. "No, of course he didn't. He accepted a chair that someone materialized from somewhere, but he didn't sit in it. He stood behind it, hands resting on its back, as if the gravity of what he was about to say required him to remain on his feet." By now, the circle of listeners had grown considerably. Guests from 3 or 4 adjacent tables had quietly repositioned themselves. No one was pretending to do anything else. What General Alcott told us that night I had never heard before, not one word of it. He told us about a crisis in the North Atlantic 40 years earlier, during a period of heightened Cold War tension that most people in that ballroom had either forgotten or never known. He told us about catastrophic equipment failures during a night of violent seas. He told us about young sailors, boys, really, most of them, who were in positions of extreme danger with their commanding officers working to get them out. He told us that my father had spent hours in those conditions, not at a distance, not at a command post, but physically present where the risk was greatest, leading rescue operations when he could have remained in a safer position and justified it. "Several men who are alive today," the general said, "are alive because of choices your father made during approximately 4 hours on a November night in the North Atlantic." He paused. He never wrote about it. He never applied for the commendation that was technically available to him. He deflected every attempt to formally recognize what he'd done. I felt something unlock in my chest, something I hadn't known was locked. Why didn't he tell us? My voice came out smaller than I intended. General Alcott looked at me with an expression of gentle patience. "Because men shaped the way your father was shaped don't measure courage by whether anyone noticed it." Silence. One of the women near our table pressed a hand to her mouth. An older man standing slightly behind the circle, a veteran, I would learn later, though I didn't know him, had closed his eyes briefly. Richard sat completely still. The confident social ease that was his most natural mode had left him entirely. He looked like a man watching something he understood only intellectually arriving with unexpected physical weight. "He received decorations he never displayed," the general continued. "He turned down 2 opportunities for promotion because the positions would have meant leaving the people he was responsible for before he felt they were ready. He mentored more junior officers than most people in this room have ever supervised in any context." He looked around the circle of listeners. His gaze traveled, unhurried, across the expensive watches and designer gowns and the various emblems of a kind of success that measured itself in portfolio values. "He never cared about recognition," the general said. "That was not unusual for him. What was unusual was how consistently he extended that same grace, I suppose is the word, to the people under his command. He protected people. Quietly, persistently, without expectation of return." A wealthy developer near the back of the circle spoke up. "If he was so respected, why haven't most of us heard of him?" "Because he actively avoided it," the general smiled. "He was the most uncooperative subject I ever tried to honor publicly. I spent 3 years, at various points, attempting to get him to appear at events, to accept formal recognition, to let his record speak at something louder than a whisper. He always found a reason to be somewhere else." He looked at me. "I suspect you recognize that behavior." I laughed, a real laugh, sudden and involuntary. "Yes, sir, completely." The room laughed with me. Not at anything, but with the release of a truth landing cleanly. One story led to another. The ballroom had transformed, without anyone declaring it, into something more intimate and more real than any charity gala. Veterans who'd been scattered through the crowd drifted in. Retired officers. Former service members in their 70s who'd worn their decorations quietly to an event like this and spent the evening discussing real estate returns with people who'd never once been asked to be away from their families for months at a stretch. An elderly man found me at one point, retired Marine Corps, he said, though he volunteered nothing else. He shook my hand with both of his. I served alongside your father once, he said. One deployment, but I've never forgotten the way he ran his ship. His eyes had a particular quality. The best officer I encountered in 30 years, not because of what he could order people to do, because of what he made people want to be. A retired Navy chai. F. Petty officer standing nearby nodded without being asked. Same, exactly that. Another veteran touched my arm. Your grandfather wasn't exactly a slouch either, if you'll forgive my saying so. That surprised me. I looked at him. You knew my grandfather. He smiled broadly. Everybody who was around in that era knew your grandfather. He was the kind of person you told stories about, the good kind. I thought about my grandfather, the man who had told me stories about food fights in mess halls and card games in port cities, and a friend named Bertolucci who could imitate 3 different accents simultaneously. He had never told me about combat. Not once. I'd learned, only after his death, the actual shape of his service record. The commendations. The official language describing things he'd done that he'd never described to any of us. My family, across 3 generations, had apparently mastered the art of carrying their own histories lightly enough that the people who loved them most didn't know the full weight of what they held. As all of this unfolded, I watched Richard. It is a strange thing to watch someone you've been married to for over a decade have an encounter with reality that reorganizes their fundamental assumptions. There is nothing triumphant about it, even if part of you has been waiting for it. It is simply uncomfortable and necessary, and, if you still love the person, quietly heartbreaking. Richard sat with his wine glass in front of him, untouched, while the room that he'd spent weeks preparing to impress turned its full attention toward a woman he'd spent 12 years failing to understand. General Alcott turned to him at one point. The room was quieter now, more concentrated. Everyone felt what was coming. How long have you been married? The general asked pleasantly. 12 years, Richard said. The general looked at him, a long, level, absolutely calm look. 12 years, he repeated, then, and you didn't know. It wasn't a question. It wasn't an accusation. It was simply an observation delivered with the precision of someone who spent a career dealing in facts. Richard had no immediate response. The general shook his head, very slowly, with an expression of bewildered, saddened wonder. And then he said it, the sentence that stopped the room, that traveled through Charleston's social fabric for the following year, that people repeated at dinner tables and in offices and on porches. Good God, almost a whisper, he has absolutely no idea who you are. The evening eventually ended. It always does. The ride home was the longest 20 minutes I can remember. Richard drove. I watched the old streets of Charleston pass outside the window, gas lamps, Spanish moss, the harbor wind moving through the palms. Beautiful city. Full of history it doesn't always know how to carry. He didn't speak for most of the drive. When he finally did, his voice was different from any version of it I'd heard before. Smaller, more careful, like a man testing ice. I had no idea, he said. I kept looking out the window. You should have told me. I turned toward him then, and I asked the question that had been forming in my chest since long before that evening. Would it have mattered? He didn't answer immediately. That silence contained 12 years. Richard didn't sleep well that night. I heard him up before 5. By the time I came downstairs, he was at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee he'd stopped drinking, staring at nothing with the expression of a man conducting a difficult internal audit. I poured my own coffee. I sat across from him. Neither of us performed normalcy. After a while he said, I meant it when I said it. I waited. I believed it. That's the part I can't dismiss. He looked up. I actually believed it, that your family was less than. He said the word with obvious difficulty. Not as people, but as, I don't know, as stories worth caring about. I thought about how to respond to that. I thought about it for a long time, sitting with my coffee while the morning light came slowly through the kitchen windows. I know, I finally said. I've watched you believe it for years. He flinched. You never said anything cruel, I said. You never insulted anyone to their face. You just found us uninteresting. And then last night you said out loud what you'd been communicating quietly for over a decade. He was quiet for a long time. Then, what do I do with that? I shook my head. I don't know yet. The consequences that followed were not dramatic. No public scandal erupted. No career burned to the ground. Richard was not destroyed by what happened in that ballroom. He was instead held accountable, quietly, precisely, in the way that actually costs something. A retired judge who had been present at the gala called him directly 2 days later. A longtime business associate made a pointed comment over lunch. A veterans organization that had been considering partnering on one of Richard's development projects withdrew from discussions, citing, when pressed, concerns about the values reflected in his public comments. Charleston is a city that remembers. It is a city where certain things matter to certain people in ways that cannot be purchased or networked away. And it is, as Richard was discovering, a city with a long memory for how people speak about those who served. He came home one evening, about 3 weeks after the gala, and sat down at the kitchen table with an expression I hadn't seen on him before. Not embarrassed, not angry, genuinely troubled. The Veterans Housing Partnership fell through, he said. I looked at him. They said my comments raised concerns about my character. He rubbed the back of his neck. About whether I was the kind of person they wanted associated with their work. I said nothing. One comment, he said, and then stopped, because he heard himself and he knew what the sentence he was about to complete would reveal. He put his head in his hands. And for the first time in our marriage, I watched Richard Collins sit with a consequence he couldn't talk his way around or buy his way out of. A month after the gala, Richard did something that surprised me completely. He called General Alcott. Not to explain himself, not to manage the situation. He called him and said directly, I think I need an education, and I think you're the person to give it to me. The general, apparently, agreed. What began as one lunch became 3 hours. The 3 hours became a series of conversations. The conversations became something that looked, unexpectedly, like mentorship. Richard started asking me questions. Real questions, the kind I'd waited 12 years for him to be curious enough to ask. What was deployment actually like? How did my mother manage the stretches when my father was gone? What made me choose to serve? What did service mean to me, not as an abstract value, but in my actual, lived experience? I answered cautiously at first. Then, as the weeks passed and the questions kept coming, more fully. One evening, he came home from lunch with General Alcott and sat beside me on the couch with an expression I'd only started to recognize. Genuine reflection, unperformed. He told me something today, Richard said. He said your father was incapable of keeping score. I smiled. That's accurate. He said most people spend their lives trying to ensure they're credited for what they contribute. Your father actively avoided it. He shook his head slowly. He said the people who actually change things rarely talk about themselves. The room was quiet for a moment. I've spent my entire professional life doing the exact opposite, Richard said, not with self-pity, with recognition, the kind that precedes actual change. About 2 months after the gala, Richard asked if I would take him somewhere. Where? I asked. He took a moment before he answered, Arlington. I looked at him for a long time. My father wasn't buried at Arlington, but many people he'd served alongside were. Many members of the extended military family I'd grown up inside. Arlington is sacred ground in a way that transcends religion. It is the physical record of what service costs, row after row of white markers standing in orderly formation across rolling green hills. I had visited before, Richard never had. 2 weeks later, we flew to Washington. The morning was overcast and cool, the sky the color of old pewter. We walked the grounds for nearly an hour before either of us spoke. The scale of it never diminishes. The rows of markers stretch to the horizon in every direction. each one representing a complete human life. A particular person with particular people who loved them, a particular laughter, a particular habit, a particular way of being in the world, reduced by death to a name and 2 dates, and the word beloved or the designation of rank. Richard walked beside me in complete silence. His hands were in his pockets. His face was working through something. Eventually, he stopped. He stood still for a long time, looking out across hundreds of white headstones, catching the gray morning light. "So many," he said finally. "Yes." "I understood it abstractly," he said. "I knew the numbers existed. I knew what the word sacrifice referred to, but I never," he stopped, started again. "I never felt the weight of it before." We sat on a bench eventually, overlooking a long sweep of the grounds. Families passed. A small child asked her father what all the white stones were for. A veteran in his 80s stood completely still before one particular marker for a very long time. Richard spoke without looking at me. "I owe your father an apology." "He's not here." "I know," a pause. "I owe him one anyway." I waited. When I said what I said at the gala, I thought I was making a social observation about status, about where certain families fell in a certain hierarchy. He shook his head. I wasn't. I was dismissing the values that made you who you are. I was telling you that the most important inheritance you received, the thing you actually are, underneath all of it, wasn't worth my attention. My throat tightened. "And I wasn't just dismissing your father," he continued quietly. "I was dismissing every family that sat in every military housing unit while their person was somewhere far away, doing something dangerous, for reasons that had nothing to do with money." He looked at me. His eyes were wet, not dramatically, just honestly. "I don't know how to fix that," he said. "I don't know if it's fixable." I looked at him for a long time. I thought about my father. I thought about the grace he had extended, repeatedly, across his entire career, to young sailors who made mistakes, to people who disappointed him, to anyone who was willing to learn and grow and try to be better. He believed, categorically, that most people were more than their worst moments. I thought about what I actually wanted, not what felt satisfying or just, what I actually wanted. "He would forgive you," I said finally, without hesitation. Richard exhaled. "Really?" "Yes, but," I waited until he was looking at me. "He would expect you to learn from it, not perform the lesson, learn it." Richard nodded. I am." I looked at his face. I believed him. Not because he said it, because I had watched it happening, day by day, choice by choice, over the preceding weeks. "Then that," I said, "is exactly what he would have wanted." That evening, back at the hotel, Richard sat quietly for a long time. The city lights moved beyond the window. The sounds of Washington at night came through softly. He spoke eventually, without preamble. "Can I ask you something?" "Yes." "Do you think your family, your father, your grandfather, did they know how much they mattered?" I thought about this carefully. "My father knew he'd done his job," I said. "He knew the people he'd served alongside. He knew the sailors he'd mentored. He had those relationships. That was his evidence." A pause. Whether he knew the full extent, whether he understood that 20 years after retirement, a 4-star general would stop in the middle of a ballroom because he recognized a watch, I shook my head gently. "No, I don't think he knew that." Richard was quiet. "But I also don't think he needed to," I said. "That's the thing I've been sitting with this whole year. He wasn't doing any of it to be remembered. He was doing it because it was right. The memory is a side effect. The legacy is a side effect." I looked down at the watch on my wrist. The actual thing was the doing. A full year passed. The same ballroom, the same crystal chandeliers, the same harbor view beyond the same floor-to-ceiling windows, the same annual charity gala, the same string quartet, many of the same faces. And yet the room felt entirely different. Or perhaps I was different, probably both. Richard stood beside me as we entered, and the easy, performing confidence he'd once carried as his primary social tool was still present, but quieter now. Reoriented. He had been volunteering, for several months, with a veterans' housing initiative. Not because anyone had suggested it, not because it was good for his professional image, but because General Alcott had taken him there one Saturday morning and something had caught. He showed up week after week. He unloaded supplies. He listened to veterans describe things he had no framework for and didn't pretend otherwise. He learned, genuinely, without performance, what it meant to help without needing credit for it. He was a different man than the one who had sat at this ballroom's table 12 months ago and casually dismissed 3 generations of extraordinary people in 5 words. Not a perfect man, not a transformed man, a changing one, and changing is what matters. During the evening's program, a brief awards portion recognized several community contributors. Richard's name was called for the veterans' housing work, for other charitable commitments he'd quietly expanded over the course of the year. He walked to the microphone, looking genuinely uncomfortable, which I found more encouraging than any amount of practiced ease would have been. He looked at the room, then he looked at me. "My name is Richard Collins," he said. He paused. "I'm fortunate to be married to a woman I spent too many years failing to properly understand." The room was very still. "She comes from a family that gave 3 generations to this country in ways most of us in this room have never been asked to. And somewhere along the way, I confused what I could measure with what actually mattered." He looked back at the crowd. "Real greatness isn't what you accumulate," he said. His voice was steady. "It's what you give, and what you're willing to give when no one is watching." I pressed my lips together, because those were my father's words, essentially, not quoted, but lived into. Understood from the inside, now, rather than filed away as the motto of a world Richard had once found uninteresting. I heard them in a new way. Later, after the event, we stood on the harbor terrace. The night air was cool off the water. Boats moved slowly across the black expanse. The city lights reflected in long, trembling lines. We stood together quietly for a while. No agenda, no performance. Just the particular piece of 2 people who have come through something honest and found themselves, improbably, still standing side by side. Richard broke the silence. "You know what I keep thinking about?" "What?" "The watch." He glanced at my wrist. That it was the watch that did it. This completely ordinary, scratched, unremarkable watch that I probably walked past 100 times in 12 years without registering. He shook his head. The most important thing in the room, and it was invisible because it didn't look like importance. I looked down at my father's watch. The hands moved steadily. They always did. "That's what he was like," I said. "The most important presence in any room he ever entered. Completely invisible to anyone who was only looking for importance in the places they expected to find it." Richard was quiet for a moment. Then, "You could have destroyed me that night." I smiled softly. "You managed that portion yourself." He laughed, a real laugh, the kind that arrives without effort. Then more quietly, "You could have walked away, after you had every right to." "I know. Why didn't you?" I thought about my father. About what he would have said, in his plain, uncomplicated way, about a person who makes a significant mistake, and then genuinely, visibly, accountably begins the work of becoming better. "Because my father taught me that most people are more than their worst moments," I said, "if they're willing to learn from them." Richard nodded slowly. "Were you?" I asked. He looked at me. "I'm trying to be." That was the right answer. Not "yes, I have changed, I am fixed, I am finished," but "I am trying," the continuous tense, the honest tense. I looked out at Charleston Harbor, the dark water, the distant lights, the boats moving unhurried across the surface of something very old and very large. My father had looked at harbors like this one countless times. So had his father before him. 2 men who gave decades of their lives to something that didn't pay well or guarantee recognition, who came home and didn't talk about it, who raised families in thin-walled houses and made dinner from grocery store coupons and taught their children, by example rather than instruction, what it meant to be genuinely, quietly, durably good. A family of nobodies. I thought about those words one final time, and then I let them go completely. Because the truth was, and had always been, the opposite. My family were the kind of people entire rooms went silent for, not because they sought it, not because they announced themselves, but because the weight of a life fully given to others, without expectation of return, has a gravity that eventually becomes impossible to ignore. My father understood that. he never would have wanted to be standing on that terrace, hearing this story told. He would have found a reason to be somewhere else entirely, probably somewhere useful, somewhere quiet, somewhere nobody was looking. That was precisely the point. The greatest inheritance he left me wasn't a watch, or a scholarship fund, or a military record that reduced a 4-star general to stunned reverence in the middle of a ballroom. It was a set of values: duty before comfort, humility before recognition, people before prestige, character when nobody is watching. Those values are alive. They pass from one person to another, one conversation at a time, one honest choice at a time, one moment of choosing to become better rather than remain defended. Even in Richard. Especially in Richard. And perhaps that, more than any public reckoning, more than any moment of social reversal, is the truest testament to what my father spent his life building. Not a legacy you read about. A legacy you become. If this story reminded you of someone who served quietly, sacrificed without asking to be seen, or shaped who you are without ever taking credit for it, hold them close today. And if you've ever been the person who underestimated someone who deserved better and found your way toward understanding, that story matters too. We grow when we're willing to tell the truth about both. Thank you for being here. Take care of yourselves. Take care of one another.